The Joyful Friar podcast is made possible by the generous support of our friends. To support the podcast, please visit nathan-castle.com and donate today. Hello and welcome to this episode of the Joyful Friar podcast. I'm Father Nathan Castle, your host. This episode is part 2 in a trilogy. Last week, I introduced you to the basics of the story that we're calling Sherman, Angel Ralph, and Travel Agent Merle. I had received a dream during the night of, March 28th of 2023. So a year and a half ago, or going on 2 years. And in this one, I'll just read it to you. This story has not been told in a book, which makes it different from all the other ones I've ever done on the podcast. We archive our stories, and then when we're thinking of putting together a next book, we pray over the pile of stories and create some sort of a construct for creating a collection. Well, this time, when we first started the podcast more than 2 years ago, I had in the back of my mind that this could be another forum for telling these stories without always publishing a book. It might make them available to more people because, for one thing, listening to a podcast is donation based. It's free if you want it to be free, and that's not the case for books. So anyway, Sherman was what we would call a middle-aged businessman, family man, married man with kids. He didn't tell us where he was going that day, but he was on a highway. He was he and the other traffic were approaching a tunnel, but a vehicle ahead of him that turned out to be a flatbed truck hauling some kind of non-standard sized equipment. He thought it might be air conditioning or heating equipment of an industrial kind, and it was odd sized. And the driver of the van of the cab pulling it miscalculated. The load was too tall. It hit the top of the facing of the tunnel. It it caused the vehicle to come to a stop at highway speed. Stuff fell off of it. Other cars crashed into it. A fireball. People died, including Sherman. So that's the nuts and bolts of it. He explained that upon leaving his body, first of all, he was at the scene of this circumstance, and as it was unfolding, he noticed there were people that were marking where there were dead bodies, and he was trying to help. And he said, but I was not able to help. Then he said, I had a flip phone, but it wouldn't work. Often that's a way that in the moment, as people are just leaving the body in a sudden way, they their normal means of communication don't work. And for those of us that carry phones, that's so normal anymore. His phone wouldn't work. He couldn't call anybody. Um, and then he felt like he needed to collect up things. In fact, when he got a chance to speak to us about it, he he compared it to the way that you might leave a plane. He said you check in the pocket to make sure you didn't leave anything in there, a wallet, keys, a phone, um, or the overhead bin. You make sure that the stuff that's necessary that belongs to you stays with you. And he said, I did something like that. And we learned from his guardian that that's quite common for people when they die in a sudden violent way, or even when they don't, when they die a peaceful death, that sometimes at the moment of transitioning out of body, that's a thing. Anyway, he explained that he got into a van that came for him. And he said, you don't get into just any old vehicle that drives. I think it was his guardian that said, you don't just hop in the first vehicle that goes by. You get in the one that came for you, and that maybe you've arranged to have come for you. He said it was a little like that. He got in a van that he knew was the appropriate vehicle to take him elsewhere. But in Sherman's understanding, or the way that the dream unfolded for him, he asked if this is Phoenix. And I lived in the Valley of the Sun in Tempe at Arizona State for 12 years. Anyway, he said he felt like he was in a part of it that was kind of dangerous, like seedy, dark. And he said later, he said, I was the one that brought that to it. I was not brought to an unpleasant place. I just had an unpleasant emotion that made me feel like I was in such a place, but that passed quickly. Other people came to him to help him get acclimated. Well, one of the things that he explained to us was that he was a businessman and that one of his skills in the workplace and in management was being adaptable, understanding what the circumstance is, even if it just shifted, staying focused and being able to adapt to changing circumstances was an important workplace skill. Um, so he said, I understood that things had just changed quite significantly, and I was told about how they had. And he said, it's not that there weren't negative emotions of fear and anger, regrets, and so on. He said that they helped him with that. See if I can find it here in the text. I'm going to do a little bit more reading to you because, as I mentioned, this one's never been in print. So I don't have a place that I can send you to read it for yourself, at least not just yet. Um, but he he was good at separating things out. He was speaking to us. In this case, it was to my partners, Dave, who is a retired dentist, and Kim, who is still active in her career as a counselor. And uh, he said this: everything was happening rapidly at the time that I died, but today I'm ready to do this with you because I have been well trained. I've had the benefit of healing workers who were competent and skilled and who helped me through frightening emotions like shock and anger. Listen to this. Those are legitimate things. He's talking about frightening emotions like shock and anger. Those are legitimate things, but in the end, they are points of data that don't have to be more than that. They don't have to intrude, frighten, or arouse anger. I just think that's profound. And it's a way that I live a good part of the time. I'm, I'm not 68 years old, going on 69, and I've had enough experiences of life that I did uh, get all caught up in emotions like shock and anger. And I think I've found in my own life, maybe you have in yours, that sometimes that just makes it more difficult. Is it possible to set those aside? Well, uh, only if you try. And he did try. He said, I had the benefit of healing workers who were competent and skilled who helped me sort through these things. But he availed himself of kind of a professional expertise that was available to him and interested in his welfare. And he said, I moved through those things. They're legitimate, but in the end, they are points of data that don't have to be more than that. They don't have to intrude, frighten, or arouse anger. Well, in the second of these trilogies that we do, we tell the story in the first segment, and then the second one we call it compassionate response. Well, as a preacher, a public speaker, I was taught to be attentive to who is your audience and what do they need to hear. Well, most of the time when I do these part two compassionate response ones, I'm thinking of you and of what comes from this story that would most benefit you as a compassionate person who might have a response to the story. This time, I think I was led to think of it more in terms of Sherman's capacity for self compassion. He was compassionate to himself, and I think that's the way that he can be helpful or instructive to us today. Um, I remember, I haven't heard this phrase in a long time, but when I was growing up, people used this phrase like, I gave myself a stern talking to. People would have some dilemma going on in their life and conflicting thoughts and emotions, and maybe some wasted effort or frustration, and say, I gave myself a stern talking to. And that usually meant a very logical talking to, setting aside emotions that might be kind of bossy. Emotions, maybe you've experienced it. Uh, Emotions can lead you around by the nose, take you places you don't want to go. And later you might be able to recognize, well, the behavior I did when I did or said that thing, it was because I was overwhelmed with emotion. Well, he said I had great helpers helping with that, and they helped me set aside fear and anger. Those are two very important ones. He said they're just data points after a while. So, um, um, he said when he got to the place where he described as or questioned whether it was Phoenix, he said it was a new experience and I had to adapt in an instant. I know that some people die and they go unconscious and they simply awaken in a peaceful other place. Then they adapt. What's this place I'm in? But others like me move through it more sequentially. I had some sort of alert consciousness that knew that my travel had been interrupted and I needed to somehow inform someone that I would not be arriving on time or that there had been a change of plans. So this is really quick subsequent to his going out of body and dying, at least dying to the body, that he understood that my plans have just changed and I need to try to inform somebody who's going to be presuming uh, what we had planned on. That made me want to be part of using my phone. It wasn't so much to call emergency workers, it was to notify whoever was expecting to my arrival. Um, I felt like I needed to say something. I wouldn't be there on time. Anyway, he described that, and then um, he said that there were things about me that I had to figure out in the moment. I what's essential to me. And he said, when you're leaving a plane, it might be, your briefcase, your purse, your wallet, your phone, whatever. I had to kind of in an instant make sure that what was essential to me came with me. That was the way he approached it. He said the place wasn't unpleasant at all. It was just that I brought that to it at least temporarily. That's understandable enough. He was, violently killed in a crash. Now, this part I really want to call some attention to. He says, the place where I wasn't bad. In fact, it was just what I called for. I had to do a bit of grieving that I left behind loved ones in surroundings that were pleasant and of my choosing, and I was pretty quickly thrust into something else. So I just needed to let that play itself out. It's it seemed natural enough to him that there would be sadness and grief about having died very suddenly, but he just said, I just needed to let that play itself out. Sometimes that sounds passive, doesn't it? It doesn't say I needed to take the bull by the horns and force some change of thought. He just said, I just needed to let that play itself out. You might find that helpful because sometimes we might want to be the master of every emotion, and that can be called for. On the other hand, sometimes we just need to let things play themselves out, be patient with ourselves, and see what happens next. I was old enough to have had other experiences in my life that were disruptive, some of them rather predictable. And then he quoted me because he's in my mind um, about sometimes there are changes in one's life, like the end of a university term or graduation, where you knew it was coming, but it still means leaving your friends behind. And there's an adaptation that needs to happen, um, even if you anticipated it. And keep even it's even more difficult if you didn't in a case of a sudden death. So he said, I didn't shake off the emotional content. I but I did at least set it off to the side or contextualize it. I was a businessman. I was able to put on that hat. You might have to leave the house in the morning having fought with your wife or kicked the dog or something went wrong with the kids, but then you get to work and you know that I'm paid to be here and to be competent at this task. Those other things need to be set aside until later. How about you? Uh, if you have a professional life, haven't you had to do that sometimes? Um, it's just not necessary for your workplace to be filled with whatever other um, emotions and context might be going on in your life. I know as a priest, if I'm having a bad day and I'm going to leave my room and go out into the public, people have a right to assume that I will treat them kindly and with compassion and care. And I need to get there. I need to be able to uh, talk to myself and say, I know you're having a bad day, Nathan, but let's go. We've got work to do. And then, of course, I'm a man of prayer. I say to the Lord, my own powers today, my own energy is low or troubled. I need extra help today. Um, there's a monastic practice that says, set, O God, a guard over my lips. Don't let me say anything unguarded that would be hurtful to anyone or harmful, sarcastic, that kind of thing. So I sometimes do that. I'll say, make sure that whatever comes out of my mouth uh, is respectable and that those words of a gentleman. That's what I want to be. Anyway, he said I was a businessman. I knew that when I got to work, I needed to be competent at the task and set the other things aside until later. They'll get their turn. Uh, he spoke to Dave, who was one of my partners, who's a retired dentist, and he said, "Dave, you're a dentist. I wouldn't have wanted to open my mouth to you if you were fuming about something that happened at home. I would hope that drill in your hand is what you're focused on, and that only that, and not any other thing." And that made us both kind of, well, he was inside me, but it made me laugh inside. And Dave said, "You're totally right. I might leave home mad, but once you get there, you got to move forward and be happy." And Sherman said, "Well, if not happy, at least focused." Exactly, Dave said. I knew how to focus and I knew the wisdom of it. I also employed and managed people. I knew that if I saw an unfocused employee at work, I had to call out the behavior and say, "Why is this? You're usually so skilled and competent. Why is your work slipping?" So I had to do some of that and say to myself, okay, you would have died of something. You died of this. You were never guaranteed a long life on the earth, and in fact, you didn't get one. And then he laughed. You had a life that was cut short by an accident on a highway, but that can be the starting point of what's next. Don't you love this guy? I died on the highway. I was never guaranteed a long life, but this can be the starting point of what's next. So I began to do what's next. Um, my helpers were doing two things at once. They were helping me heal, if you will, and say, you don't need to have accomplished this in one act of the will. You don't need to say, henceforth and forever, I'll never be sad again about my death. But I knew that's where I wanted to go. That's the direction I wanted to head. He, that's wise. You know, you can see a direction you want to go and begin going there, but don't demand of yourself that you arrive the minute you departed. Sometimes things take a while, and there's that idea of something being, two steps forward, one step back. Um, I use that old image of taking lemons and making lemonade. As a Christian, I don't know how I could live any other way. Good Friday becomes Easter Sunday. That's just the way the universe goes. Um, he said, I like the idea of being useful. I was brought up with a servant's heart. He said, my parents were conventionally Christian. Um, uh, I knew that I wanted to be of service. Um, as I regrouped, that luggage metaphor came up again. There are some things that come with you, but you have to collect them. You have to decide what's important and what isn't. That involves some sort of sorting and sifting. Then he addressed himself to, I had two prayer partners. Dave is retired dentist, and Kim is, a younger woman still active in her career as a counselor. He said, Kim, I think you're familiar with that as a counselor. Maybe you help people set aside that's the thoughts that aren't helpful anymore, or close the book on pieces of a life that are intruding in some way that's unhelpful. I had to adjust to the fact that my wife is now a widow. My children are at least in some way fatherless. So there was a little bit of working on how I can be actively a part of their life in a way that isn't creepy. Well, I've run across that before, that people who die, especially when their children are minors, could be later even than that, but especially when they're young, people often want to know, okay, well, what are the rules? Is there a way in which I can have some sort of interest, activity, uh, presence in their life in my afterlife form? And he said there's schools where they teach you how to do that without being creepy, or how to do that without it being kind of detrimental to your own progress. It's um, it's a balancing act, isn't it? Have you moved somewhere before and you want to keep in touch with the old gang back in the previous place? And which is a good thing. But on the other hand, you have to be available to the new moment and the new opportunities and new opportunities to serve, not just constantly pining to be where you used to be. Anyway, he said, I know that the love that I have, uh, how do I honor the commitments that I made that are suddenly ripped from me? Is there some way that they pertain? Uh, and I know that heaven is supposed to be something fun and exciting and glorious. How do I move in that direction while still having sadness? He tried to avoid using the word sad, and then he decided, I don't think I even need to avoid it. I just had a sadness sometimes, but I tried not to let it be too bossy. Well, then it was time for him to move along, which is, the point of these encounters at all. We were going to help him. We call it crossing. Sometimes I hear ascend, move on. But he said, that's the whole point of why I'm here. So let's do that. Would you help me do the thing that I came for? He said he had been watching us. He had been standing in a line. He watched the people ahead of him in line, and he knew that sometimes we encourage people to call forth a specific person. Sometimes we'll ask the question, can you think of somebody who died before you did, who you know loves you, and who you'd be happy to see, who could, escort you? We do that sometimes, but he said, I know that sometimes you just, the guardian angel will just take care of it, or sometimes someone just emerges. And he said, I think I'd rather just see what emerges. So that was his choice. And this is just so cool for a businessman who is methodical about um, plans. He said, well, this is unexpected. Her name is Merle. She was a part of my life that was beginning to recede. She was older and near retirement age, but for years, Merle had been my travel agent. Isn't that the coolest thing? He needed a travel agent in the afterlife because he was going to go on an adventure uh, to a place he'd never been. So he needed a travel agent to help him methodically move through that. Um, she had been my travel agent in the days before one could jump on one's own machine and have access to airline schedules. You used to have to go to a small storefront and listen while somebody tapped the keys to tell you what your options were. I did that for years. Um, she had a heart for her occupation. She only learned the computing part because it helped her to do the fun part. She liked the brochure. She especially liked it when people came to her knowing that they wanted to travel but weren't quite sure what they might do. She liked the dreamy, aspirational part of it. Have you thought about Tahiti? Sometimes she'd been on junkets that hotels would take her on, or on a cruise that would give her a free or heavily discounted trip so that she might have direct experiences of places and be able to personally recommend them. That's the way some of those businesses operated. Uh, she liked the part where she could say, well, it just happens that I just returned from the Yukon in this glacier or whatever. She would have adventures that she could vouch for. Um, I had felt like I'd been dropped off in a place where I didn't want to be. But when you travel to far-flung places, you hope that when you get there, someone's in charge of the luggage and your name is on the registration. Everything is arranged and it works out smoothly. So apparently, Merle is surfacing as my afterlife travel agent. Isn't that cool? I just think God's universe has so many wonderful delights in it, and this businessman remembered this business relationship he had with Merle, who organized his travel, and here she was again doing it for him. He said, I really haven't decided on a destination. Where do I want to go? Who do I want to be with? I haven't put a lot of focused effort into answering those questions, but apparently accommodations can be made that you don't have to have decided because there are people who can help you decide. Um, so I'm going to go wherever she takes me. And then he said, I'm being fed. There was movement into his consciousness. He said, I'm being told that it won't be to an office or a computer. So she's not going to take me to work. I'm going to go to a restaurant or something, someplace where she and I can get reacquainted over a fine meal or a fine experience of some kind. Later, there'll be more of that business part where we sit down and look at brochures or timetables and schedules. Um, and then he said, you might maybe you're finding in your life that life is already like that for you. I hope that's true. I hope it just has a way of presenting good things to you. And even in a case like mine, where it presented one very bad day, and he was laughing as he said that, even after the very bad day, there are other joys to be had if you will allow them to emerge. So if you're having a very bad day or you feel like you're in a very bad season, I hope you can take his words to heart and say the universe has a way about it that one thing flows after another and the bad day turns into something good. There are other joys to be had if you allow them to emerge. Um, for whatever reason, he brought up a zip line. He said, I don't think there'll be spectacular movement. I'm thinking of those lines that you get on and you fly across a river or a jungle. And Kim said, You mean a zip line? And he said, Yeah, one of those. I don't think it's anything as extraordinary as that. Merle is presenting the way that I remember her. None of us have to be any given age, but I think she's still the rather mature lady that I remember at the end. I think we'll be doing something sedate but pleasant. And then he laughed about that. Um, and then Dave said, Great talking to you, Sherman. He said, All right, no need for me to hang around here. Thank you for the good work you do. Bye now. So, so compassionate response. That's what this episode has been about. I just think that Sherman did a great job of being compassionate toward himself, and that maybe that's something that we could ponder. Is there any way in which you're making life more difficult than it might be? You could go back over this, and I quote him quite a lot. You could ask for the helpers that help you just see some of the sadnesses as points of data that don't have to turn into emotions that steer you where you don't want to go. Anyway, I just love the way that he was kind to himself and the way that that enabled him to make good um, decisions. In the next one, in next week's episode on spiritual practice, we're going to go in a little bit into the fact that it might sound callous that he spent so little time uh, grieving his his widowed wife and his kids. He's going to explain just a little bit about that next time, so we'll hold that off. It's not that he was just this um, machine. He was a fully embodied human being with emotions and feelings, but he just said, I needed to adapt. And so I adapted. Okay. Well, that's it for this time. Remember that I pray for you regularly. When I do, I pray for healing of anything in your body, mind, and spirit at the present or going way back in your life to the source of any sadness or grievance or anything that is unfree. And I regularly pray that for you. So I'm grateful that you either listen to this or watch it, the video version. If you'd like to be in touch with me, that can be done through my website, which is nathan-castle.com. I do ask that if you're going to ask a question that pertains to this whole realm, that you read at least the first of my three Afterlife Interrupted books so that when we do talk or communicate, we can have a richer conversation. But with that, that's it for this time. God bless you, and please join me next time. Bye now.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of The Joyful Friar. Please like, follow, and subscribe. You can visit me at nathan-castle.com. Send me a message by clicking the contact button. God bless.